Okay, now that we're live, welcome everyone. Today I'm going to be continuing my little series about the pawn structures that are addressed in Soltis' book, Pawn Structure Chess. And the pawn structure for today is the hanging pawn structure. So here it is in sort of the skeletal view. White is the one who has the hanging pawns. And as you can see, two of their pawns are on open files. Or you could call them semi-open files because they're blocked by pawns at the end from black's perspective. And this is a interesting pawn structure because there are some definite plans for black to obtain an advantage against this structure, but it's not possible every time for black to capitalize on the weakness of the C and D pawns by attacking them from the front. And occasionally white is able to, or actually quite often white is able to utilize these extra pawns to gain dynamic potential. So this imbalance is quite similar to the isolated queen pawn structure, which we've already discussed a little bit in another one of my live streams. In fact, it's quite often the case that the hanging pawn structure will be transformed into an isolated queen pawn structure. For instance, if white were to advance the d pawn, it would become an isolated queen pawn. And it could be an advantageous one for white or a disadvantageous one, as you could easily imagine based on the other content we've done. And I guess we could just get into it then. It's closely related to the isolated queen pawn. It's one of the really major takeaways here. Black's strategy will generally hinge on provoking the advancement of either the C or the D pawn, because if there's a pawn on C5, let's suppose maybe a rook came over here from the front and attacked this pawn, right? So it's forced to advance, and this would leave a weak square right here. Yeah, I'll leave it as red, like this. So it's attacked by a rook or something, forced to advance, creates an outpost square. So we could put another piece on this outpost square, or even the same piece. You know, we could provoke the weakness and then come right over and jump on d5. And I hope that makes a lot of sense because I've also done a good bit about the outpost square in my live lessons. So if you guys haven't seen that, you can check it out. At any rate, the creation of the outpost square, it can be extremely useful for black in this pawn structure. And obviously the structure can appear with colors reversed, but the strategy is the same. And if they advance the d pawn, well, you know, this could turn out to be an isolated queen pawn situation. And sometimes that's quite good for black, and sometimes it's helpful for white. So let's talk about the specifics of how we use this. I have a lot of games because I went through the entire Soltis book and took notes on it a long time ago. And I think that we probably have time for about 2 games. So let's start with a game where the side that does not have the hanging pawns, that is the pawns exposed on the open C and D files, is able to successfully establish a blockade and win the game. This game is Rubinstein versus Sowa, and the game was played in, I think, like 1925. No, this one's 1908. Hey Blitzical, good to see you in the chat, and thanks for dropping in to say hello. I'm doing okay. I'm very tired, but that's kind of normal for my life. So, as expected, since the structure is closely related to the isolated queen pawn, it can happen a lot, starting from d4. But I like Soltis' choices in his book. He chose some structures that can happen in many openings, and the hanging pawns can show up in some interesting situations. Not necessarily just the obvious opening situations. So here comes c4. And I've heard that there is a Russian saying, it's always a Russian saying, that is, whenever you see 4 pawns in a square like this, on the queen side in the center. You should just take one of them. However, I've rarely ever seen top-level players utilize this advice, even in the classical era of chess. But it's interesting to note that there is this kind of phrase, because I think what is being said there is that you can't really possibly go wrong by taking one of these pawns. It's going to lead to a mass liquidation. You can't be worse. I haven't rigorously tested that because it doesn't suit me to play moves without thinking. And I don't think I come into the situation often enough that I've had to really test it out. But it's some interesting food for thought. So here comes e6. And if white played e3 here and black played knight f6, this would be the same as one of my simul games from last week. Hello, Anand. Welcome to the chat. I think he was suggesting here that we take on c5 for white, which doesn't lead to our structure. It's probably an interesting move. Although I tend to shy away from moves like this, just because I'm just making a note to myself about this. Because typically, instead of actually taking the pawn with like queen a5 and queen c5, which would give white a little bit of development, I think people are typically playing like e6, hitting this pawn. And I'm not sure if this really is like a better version of something white could typically have. For basically, if you play c4 here and then take, this is a very similar situation, right? I'm gonna make a note here to myself as well. Yeah, if they take here and then play e3, this is like the same position, except black would have knight f6 already in when they get to respond. And I'm not sure including knight f6 would actually be that helpful for black here. So by analogy, I don't think this is necessarily great for white. For instance, if you play b4, you run into the same kind of thematic problem, a5. And whatever they do, like if they play this one, that's really bad because this is pinned. If you do this one, it's really not much better because of this. I guess here you could play queen d4 or knight d4, yeah. But even then, I don't think you should be getting your material back. Like maybe just do this. And you still have to guard this pawn. Maybe you could do so passively. This is probably all kind of a theory type of question. Like maybe there's some opening theory here that I just don't know. But I kind of like black's position. Giving up a pawn with tempo is a little counterintuitive to me. Are you saying after e3? Okay. Well, here only e6 was played, so I guess you mean now. But it's sort of the same issue. If you do it here, just making a note, they get to just develop with tempo. And even if you can give black an isolated queen pawn, this is not a good version of the isolated queen pawn. So if you want to see more about that, you could go back to my live stream about the isolated queen pawn that I did somewhat recently. Basically, this extra move, bishop takes c5, is very helpful for black because they need to go for dynamic play. And just as a quick recap, since the hanging pawn structure is related, in the isolated queen pawn situation, if you have an isolated queen pawn, you are compensated in the form of control of some important squares with the pawn directly, and also the ability to use these open and half open files. So having greater control of the square in front of the isolated queen pawn faster can only be really helpful for black. I don't think there's a tactical downside of having a bishop on c5 here. In fact, if you play a move like knight c3, you might be in for a world of hurt as well. I don't know if I would rather start with like knight e7 or queen, or just pawn d4, straight up. They both look very tempting. Knight f6 is also on the table, like, might be good. I don't think there's anything wrong with black's position, but probably it's kind of going down a rabbit hole to say how we could best utilize that one tempo. So I'll just come back to the situation. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if you've seen this position before, Anand, for sure. So after knight c3, knight f6, we've got some typical development in the opening. And white chose g3, which I think makes sense because we are maybe considering that one day the d pawn will get weak, so you want to play bishop g2 and then hit it. All right, now here black has a decision to make. So I'm curious what you guys think you should play in this situation. So if you want, just suggest a move for black. Like, just guess what you think the best move is. Because of this tension with the d pawn and the c pawn, I think it's a little bit of a tricky question, even though it's just like a few moves into the game. Choosing how to handle that tension is somewhat difficult without experience. And of course, anyone who's watching the recording, this is a good time for you to pause and just test yourself. Like, how do you develop your pieces? All right, this is only a tiny puzzle. So I think that the best move is probably bishop e7, if I had to make a guess. Making a note because this wasn't in my game notes. And here, I think the thing that might dissuade someone from playing bishop e7 is the fact that white can take on c5 and you have to move your bishop again. This is in stark contrast with a position that's like this, where white has played d takes c5 of their own volition and the bishop goes from f8 to c5. That, I think, is clearly beneficial to black. But it turns out that even here, this is fine. They spent 2 moves to put their bishop on c5, but the isolated queen pawn gives black some dynamic potential. But I also do like white here. Like, let's say castle, maybe bishop g, maybe not bishop g5, but I was thinking about bishop g5, but I feel like from the games that I've seen, knight a4 might be more sensible. Like, get another tempo there and try to firmly block the isolated queen pawn. So we're going to put a piece on d4 or c5. So I do kind of like white here, but this is probably still the best way to go. Maybe if you want things to be less clear, you could play maybe you could avoid the isolated queen pawn entirely and play c4. But this is just speculation at this point. I'm really not too sure. I'm usually quite hesitant to advance my pawn to c4 in positions like this, especially if I haven't gotten the e-file opened up yet. But here, since black has the open e-file and they don't need to arrange an e5 break anymore, losing the tension in the center might not be so bad. I'm just concerned that at some point white's going to get it in like b3 and break the center, and then it's kind of just a big waste that we spent that time. Like maybe they'll castle first for safety, might play bishop e7, I guess, and white can already play b3. You can't play b5 because of knight takes b5, so you kind of have to go in for this. And after queen takes b3, there's pressure on the center pawn, and there's pressure on b7. And usually I find myself having positions like this quite easily. And in a circle is correct. Welcome to the chat. The e4 break can also be dangerous, and white can get it in like more or less whenever they want, I think. Black is not developed to prevent that break. Maybe I shouldn't say whenever they want. I just mean like for several moves, it's kind of a threat, and white can arrange it successfully. So I am not too happy about it, but if you want to go in some different direction that's not clearly bad, you can play c4. Anyway, in this game, which I think black has probably mismanaged a little bit, I should just make a general comment that I don't really like black's position in situations like this, because it always feels that they are a move behind in a symmetrical position. And white just has kind of like a nagging pressure, and they have a lot of options for how to play. I don't think that really suits black. So I don't really like this very much. And I picked this game because Soltis picked it. It's a good example for what happens when black plays in this fashion with c takes d4. Now this move was awarded a question mark by Soltis in his book Pawn Structure Chess. And let's just look at the situation after kind of normal play, right? Knight takes d4, very normal. What we have here is an isolated queen pawn for black at the moment, which is probably not the best you've ever seen. I kind of like that the bishop on g2 is hitting the d pawn from far away out of the center, because white can get their king to safety and still pressure the center. And they've already established the blockade before black can even castle. So I don't think black is quickly getting the kind of counterplay that they might have been hoping for. Hello, Unimaster. Welcome to the chat. But anyway, black went ahead and did some forcing stuff with queen b6. So if you guys want to suggest a move, especially if you're watching the recording, you can like pause the video and see what you should do. Alright, so Anna has already suggested knight b5. Which knight, if we're going for that kind of idea? But other options are also possible, so let me know what you guys think. How should we handle this situation with white? d4 knight, definitely hanging. And knight b5 is quite sharp, but there are other options too. After knight b5, like whichever one you pick, I'm sort of inclined to imagine d4 happening. Well, actually, after only knight db5, there might be d4. Your master wants to play knight to v3. That's very ambitious. Oh yes, knight b3. Bishop e3 also looks interesting, but it's objectively giving the b pawn. Yeah, bishop e3, queen takes b2 for sure. But if you play knight b3, right? Maybe black is getting in d4. Or they don't even need to play d4. Like, you could play knight b3 and then bishop to b4. I think that might be some counterplay. Bishop e3, queen b2, knight d5. Okay. But after knight takes d5, is there not... Knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, and queen c3. That looks kind of awkward. Let's look at them a little bit on the board. Not the least because I'm really tired and having a hard time. So the first thing that was mentioned was knight b5. So let's start there. If we choose this one, then there's just d4, I think. And this doesn't work because of queen takes, not pawn takes. You know, you could rescue your knight with knight takes or queen takes, but then there's queen takes h1. And here, if you move the knight, I think you just lose everything. Like, maybe you try this, but we should take first to avoid knight c7. And then you lose this knight. No good. If you put the other knight, I think this should be a problem. After bishop d2, most logical. This knight's hanging, but this bishop's hanging too. So I'm thinking... It's probably a tactic here. I'm just too tired to see it. Okay, maybe not. I'm not seeing it right now. But anyway, my first instinct was actually to play a6 here, so I think I should probably just go with that. And some stuff's hanging. Like, maybe you could deal like this. It's tempting to just take this one. But I don't know. Maybe this is actually fine if you play knight b5. It just feels kind of wrong. Like, maybe if I just play some simple move like this. it's, I'm threatening to just take and win. So you probably should play like E3. And then after A6, I don't know, or maybe not even A6, maybe just something prosaic. At the very least, I don't think black can be worse here. Like maybe just get rid of the bishops. So we also said bishop E3. I don't think knight takes D4 was a tactic because of, let's go back to this for a second. I'll just take back. And here, even if you throw like this to try to provoke bishop D2, I think they'll play this one. And if you try to gain a tempo by moving your queen, I mean, they're just going to castle and it won't happen. So I think tactics time's over there. But we were also looking at bishop E3. And we saw this one. And somebody said this move. I forget already who it was. Anand said it can't be good, but he'd play it anyway. Well, you're not gonna prove like that if you just want to play it anyway. I mean, I think if you play, it's kind of like you're saying it's good in some sense, like it's good enough, like maybe it has some practical advantages or something. I think I should take this. And I think what I was going for in the early discussion was this. So here, in a circle, was suggesting knight takes d4, I think. Because this is where I was saying some tactics, I think. Alright, take care. Thanks for dropping in. Yeah, I think after bishop b4, you have to play king f1, and then there's bishop h3, and I think this has to be good for black. I just don't know what compensation they have for the pawn. So I think bishop e3 is a dumpster fire. Like, you can play a few moves in a row, but yeah, they're like not even up material or anything. It's pretty sad. So anyway, the best move has to do with this pawn structure. So maybe I can give a hint. So the hanging pawn structure hasn't happened yet in this game, right? So how do we give black the hanging pawns? And then establish a blockade? That's the real question. So if you're watching this as a recording, you can pause again if you want. Think it over again with the hint. We can't lose the knight on d4, but we should try to give them hanging pawns. And then establish the blockade. And the way you do that is with knight takes c6. Now maybe you saw this move and you avoided it because of queen takes c6 or something. Yeah, Anand, you got it. But queen takes c6 runs into simple tactics. And I don't think that there's anything really going well here for black. For instance, they could take this and maybe even bishop takes just to allow some spice to occur. And they can throw bishop b4 check. But even here, like even where white probably should have taken with the queen on d5, I don't really think this is such a problem. Because there's tactics all over the place. For instance, let's suppose that they move their queen to try to maintain some pressure like this. Well, even this allows like a4 type shenanigans, so anyway, even in like the worst of all possible worlds, there's like bishop g2. I just don't really believe in it. But the best way to play would have been with queen takes, so that when they play bishop to b2, we can throw this one in the way, bishop d2, and then here king takes should be fine. Black hasn't castled yet, our king should be safe. Alright, so Anna was thinking b takes c6 blocks the bishop on g2. I think it's an extra target for your bishop on g2. There's this chess phrase that I'm sure you know that I absolutely despise, where people say that it's biting on granite. I think this is like the ugliest, most unartistic way to describe like how a bishop relates to some pawns on the board. And it's like bandied around so much to the point that I think it's completely lost whatever original meaning it had. Just because some pawns are like downwind from your bishop doesn't mean that it's biting on granite. Even though these pawns also, like, they can't be attacked with like c4 or easily with b5 to try to break them up. You don't really need that. You can attack them with the pieces, and the bishop's contributing to that. And if they're forced to advance, you can attack them with other pieces. I think this is a perfectly fine situation. In fact, this is desirable because imagine how hard it would be to attack this b pawn if it was not moved to c6. Now we can establish a blockade and attack the pawns from the front. So, our main task at this point will be to establish that blockade. So let's take a look at the next couple of moves. I'll give the first one because I think it's kind of obvious that we should castle our king before going through any active endeavors. And black played bishop e7. So now what we want to do is immobilize the pawns on c6 and d5 and make it so they can't advance like ever, and then activate our forces to attack those pawns. So how should we start? What do you guys think? How should we redeploy these pieces to harass and harangue the hanging pawns and also the outpost squares that are now created in front of the pawns? Whenever one pawn is forced to advance, we get some outpost squares. That's one of the key takeaways from this lesson. And we have to use those outposts. Alright, Unitermaster says rook b1 followed by bishop e3. But you really don't want your rook on b1, right? It seems like a pretty major concession to play rook b1. For instance, if you play rook b1, I'll play bishop f5 with tempo. That seems pretty helpful. And maybe I could even get my pawns rolling again using that extra development. Try to avoid getting blockaded in. Good guess, though. At least there's some logic behind it. I do think e3 is a good place for that bishop, though. You're kind of on the right track. So if you're trying to blockade the center pawns, Master, do you really want to play e4 and like give them a chance to trade off the center pawns? They're not going to play d4, but even if they do, I think they might be better. I didn't mean that they will not play d4. I mean that they don't necessarily have to. Like they could also liquidate their center pawn for your e pawn if you play e4. But after e4, d4, knight e2, c5. Oh no, we don't have any piece protecting the rook, so we probably can't sack an exchange here. d4, e4, d4. Oh wait, no, the bishop's not even attacking it. e4, d4, knight e2, c5. Yeah. You might play e5 there. Yeah, maybe they should just take on e4, like what I originally said, to avoid tactics. I'll just put in a line here real quick. I'm suggesting b3, but these moves are really passive. If you guys want to blockade and win these pawns, or use the outpost squares in front of them as a launching pad for an attack, you shouldn't start with a passive move like rook b1 or b3. Because black also has active plans, right? If they can get the pawns rolling again, they're in really good shape. So just to illustrate, I'll just put in Master's variation. I was thinking that we can just take this, and we don't have any, there's like no point in our strategy anymore, because the hanging pawns will not exist. And Master's variation was with d4, knight e2. And here I was thinking maybe c5, but this runs into e5, and I'm not sure there's really a good response here. Yeah, even looking at it, I'm still not sure. Like, we just are losing a rook. If the rook was guarded, like if we had two extra moves, like castling and bishop a6 or e6, I would just give the exchange probably. Because then we're getting knight e5 and knight f3, and it looks very strong. We'd have good compensation in the form of an attack on white's king. But I don't think it's like that. Here, we should probably just liquidate and just say goodbye to all that. Yeah, and if we take, I think knight takes back is logical. And I don't really feel like any blockades happening, like takes, castle. I'm not sure this is actually dangerous. And it can always mean bishop e3 with like either queen b2 or bishop c5. But yeah, there's a good point that if d takes, then c6 is weak. But you have to trade pieces to make it happen. And hold on. So I'm just seeing you guys all put a lot of comments. So let's look at queen c2 first, because we're right here. I don't know if you even want to trade into this endgame. Like, let's say I just throw this one in. First of all, you can't take on c6, so this is probably the biggest challenge. But now I'm threatening to take your rook and trap your bishop. So I'm not too convinced by queen c2 either, at least at first glance. But this is all like not even forced. I think that black is also fine if they don't take the knight on e4. So let's talk about this more generally. The c6 pawn is weak. It's on an open file. It's not ideally placed. But the b2 pawn is also weak. And probably you could fix your b2 pawn weakness more easily than black can fix their c pawn weakness. But I don't think it should be impossible. Like, let me try to, for sake of argument, just find a move that's not knight takes e4 here. For instance, I could play knight d5. And I don't know how you're ever going to win this pawn. This would basically just be like an IQP if you ever take on d5. Rook e1 counterattacks the e7 bishop. Hold on. I mean, we're kind of analyzing a deep line that isn't super relevant to the evaluation, but, you know, I'm curious to see what you said. I think it's here. Okay. I don't see that this is so bad for black. You haven't developed any pieces, and the only price is one pawn. Like, maybe you go here. But this is problematic as well. Like, I guess maybe I'll use this rook. I could even use the other rook. So we're really getting into some muddy territory that doesn't... I'm not sure it's productive to analyze it. But just as a sample, like, you want to move this dark square bishop so you can, like, move the light square bishop so that you don't lose the rook. So you might choose, like, d2. Maybe. But, I don't know, there's just a lot of pressure here. It seems like, at some point, it should all come back. Like, here f2's hanging. What am I saying? You can't even play bishop d2. So you have to play, like, maybe bishop f4. I don't know, I feel like black has compensation. Like, if I flip on the engine here, it's probably... It says white's only slightly better. It's like plus 0.5. So, I think that's fine. MK, welcome. Yeah, this was kind of a long way away from where we were. It's an interesting position, though, in general. So, I don't think it's wasted. Just maybe not right now. At any rate, even if e4 works, right? The point is that there is a much better way that you can establish a blockade, and it starts with knight a4. Even if e4 is fine, it doesn't matter, because we would, yeah, maybe you should still take white there, of course, but we were trying to choose something good for white, and I think that one gives tons of counterplay to black. And it's not a forced line, so it's entirely possible I just didn't find the best move, because I wasn't sitting here with the engine on or anything. Yeah, I tried to do all my live streams without really checking anything like that. But knight a4 is a really good move. This is a thematic way of dealing with the hanging pawns. It also is pretty common to play knight a4 in the isolated queen pawn. So it comes with tempo. We should consider that kind of thing, right? So then queen comes on b5 in this case. Now, how do we find the next move? Knight a4 was the best, with the idea of blockading and occupying c5. So how do we, like, keep going with this plan? This one should be much easier than knight a4. In fact, Eatermaster already said it on the last move. Knight c3, queen b6, draw. If you play knight c3, I don't think they'll play queen b6. Queen a5 came to my mind, but I'm also thinking like queen c4, just to be very incisive. You can't play b3 because your knight's hanging, so you have to do something else. And queen c4 is kind of keeping d4 on the cards. Alright, enough trolling and trush talking. I think that bishop e3 is pretty easy to find. Because now you don't even have to calculate lines with queen b2, like what you guys were saying earlier. Or just controlling and occupying c5. And they can't play c5 because of... I guess I would play knights... I guess after d5 I would just play bishop takes d5. Yeah, Unimaster got this one, it looks like. I think there's some latency, so I'm sorry if I don't respond in a timely way. So after bishop e3, I don't think these pawns can advance whatsoever, so they castled. And now what? What's the next move for us to build up the attack and control those hanging pawns? I think this is even easier than finding bishop e3. It's all very logical once you've found the right idea. Yeah, rook c1. Good. You know what's funny? Your messages are not even showing up in like at the same time in different places for me. Yeah, so it should be rook c1. And now these pawns are becoming under attack as well as blockaded. So in the game they played bishop g4. And I think this is a tricky moment. Yeah, MK also got rook c1. Good. How to proceed? It's kind of difficult because right now our pawn on e2 is hanging, right? So we cannot just, play any move here. Like you can't play, for instance, knight c5 because of bishop e2. So how do we deal with this? How do we keep up the blockade and keep putting pressure? Oh, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Soltis made a note in his book that the moves c takes d4 and queen b6 were designed to break up white's control of the center and not leave them time to occupy the d4 outpost. But because we've converted this to the hanging pawn structure, it didn't really work out well. MK says never play f3, but f3 is what we should play this time. Because if you play rook e1 after bishop b4, I think there's counterplay. I think that's the main takeaway here. So f3 and bishop e6, and you might be thinking something like, oh, now my bishop doesn't see the pawns, and their bishop is forced to go defend the pawns. But since this is a static kind of advantage, now that we've established the blockade, we can really just calmly take our time with this one. Now that we finally built up this blockade, I want to show you the finish, and then we can move on to another example. So they played bishop c5, finally occupying the outpost square. I think that you guys would not have any trouble finding this because you found all the moves to build up to this point. They have to answer the threat to their bishop, but they don't want to play bishop c5 because after bishop c5, I was going to say first knight c5 just out of instinct, but I think they might be able to play like knight d7 with counterplay or something, so maybe I'd play rook c5 with tempo. And after, I think queen a6 would be kind of necessary at some point. Or queen b7. And then we could build up with like queen c2, something like that. So they went ahead and defended with the rook, so they wouldn't have, so they could get like one more piece involved and not accelerate white's plan of total conquest. And now here the real reason behind f3 is revealed. Okay, so f3, it feels unpleasant because it blocks your bishop and so on. Not what you really want to see. The purpose is to play the move rook f2. So we got rid of black's idea with tempo by playing f3, so took all the pressure off. But it doesn't sabotage our plans. It enables us to bring the rook into the action along the second rank. So they played knight d7, and white finally traded that one. And for the first time in a few moves, black actually has a positional threat. What do you guys think black wants to do, just conceptually? If they had a free hand, what would they do to take the pressure off their position? Typically, when I ask a question like that, it's because I'm thinking about prophylaxis. There's going to be a follow-up question, like, what do they want to do, but how do we want to prevent it? Yeah, Utermaster has it, if I'm seeing the timing right. Yeah, and Anand. So we should play c5 as black. Yeah, and MK. Good. So everyone has it. At least I think so. There are probably some lurkers who also have it, and people who pause the video at home. So after c5, black would have counterplay. They could maybe get in d4 and start thinking about using the outposts and things like that. Yeah, and we should play queen d4 to prevent. Exactly right. So that's the move that was played here by Rubinstein. And after rook e to e8, you know, now that I think of it, I don't really know why he played that move. I think he's just under a lot of pressure, and you have to play some strange moves in those situations. He wants to defend the c pawn with the e rook, probably instead of the c rook, or the a rook. So I guess maybe he wants to play, because darks for bishops are off, put one rook on c8 and the other one on b8. So maybe that's why, but this really does look kind of strange. Like they lost a lot of time. Because white gets to occupy c5 and everything without much trouble. Okay, now here's another typical regroupment. Whenever you've played f3, it sort of feels weird to play, say, f4. It's like you're doing the alphabet and you say A, B, D. Like it just doesn't sound right. It seems more natural to say C, bishop f1. Because this way we get to improve the rook and the bishop at the same time when we eventually play e3. And e3 also fixes the d-pawn. You just have to be careful not to allow e3 to become weak. But since white has total domination of the queen side and the center, it seems unlikely that any bad fate should befall the e-pawn. So after rook e c8, e3 shows up, queen b7 has to happen because your queen's hanging. After knight c5, knight takes, rook takes. Another pair of pieces is off, which could benefit the side with less space, but this blockade just keeps on being blocked. Not e4. You guys keep doing that for some reason. So e4, if we went back and played e4 here, they would probably just liquidate their weakness. Like, let's say you play e4. Okay, it's with tempo, so why not? Making a note here. Okay, now I would probably react the exact same way with queen b7, but I'm just trying to look to make sure that I'm not missing some other good option. I guess if you want to play e4 without liquidating, you want to play e5, so maybe I'll play queen b8 so you can't play e5. And I'm going to play d takes e4 at some point. I think this is giving black way too much counterplay. Yeah, and now after rook c7, rook fc2. Even though this position is material equal, white is much better because they have such active pieces. Black cannot activate any of their pieces. And now, the strategy that's employed is, now that the black pawns are fixed, which is what Soltis wrote in his book, white should try to isolate one of them with a pawn break. So eventually you do, like, so the formula would be like you create the hanging pawns, you blockade the hanging pawns, you occupy all those outpost squares and activate all of your forces, and only when your pieces are at maximum effectiveness, we're going to break with like the B pawn or the E pawn, one of those. But here black went ahead and lost a pawn. So if you can win a pawn, that's even better. They played queen B6. What they should have done is some work to prevent B4 and B5. So they should have played a move like A5. But by doing this, they're losing a pawn. And I would say not in like a subtle, not in a direct kind of way. It takes a little bit of time. So maybe just think it over. How are we going to win material here? I don't know why you would want to sacrifice a pawn to trade queens here. If you could just trade queens, okay. But if you sacrifice a pawn, you're probably losing. Like, I think the strategy in these pawn structure positions, it's you're working with rather small advantages and trying to grow them. It's like you're taking a plant into your home and you're trying to like raise it up and have it be healthy and good after a long period of time. And you do that a little bit at a time, a little bit of water, fertilizer only in the right time and not too much, sunlight every day, but not so much sunlight that it gets burned, that kind of thing. So with your position, when you're cultivating it in the same way as you might cultivate like a tiny plant, you're working with something that's delicate. If you do something dramatic, it's quite likely to backfire. And I think that sacrificing a pawn would be too dramatic here. Queen c3 is interesting because it does put more pressure on c6, but it also takes away the blockade for a moment. So I wonder if when you play queen c3, will they play d4? Here, I'm going to play that and let's just see. This seems kind of logical. Which doesn't mean that it's good, but it's logical at least. I was thinking maybe I could try to muddy the waters like this. Like, not losing material, but at least not instantly. I think, yeah, this is actually working, because if you play d5 to try to return the favor, the rook's pinned. So you can really just take it. This looks like counterplay. I don't think I want to allow this kind of thing. Yeah, MK got it. That was nice. I'm glad you like my plant analogy. We're cultivating a little chess plant here. In our chess Zen garden. Okay, so maybe nothing so dramatic like that. Bishop b5 is an interesting idea. It does get a piece involved. Yeah, sorry, I didn't notice it initially, Yeatermaster. Bishop b5. I would imagine they should protect with the rook, but I don't want to make an automatic move here. The reason I want to protect with a rook like this, hold on, make a note. I want to protect the rook so that I can actually take this bishop. And we just got a follow from JC. Oh, Jackie Anderson. Sorry, I only saw it on the board. It was a little obscured. But yeah, Jackie Anderson, thank you. Yeah, here I think after rook c8, you're not able to put more pressure. So probably bishop b5 is not quite working. As usual, when there's some kind of pin situation, I like to put pressure with lower value pieces when possible. So b4 is the move that makes sense to me. And after b4, we're threatening b5. It's just pretty straightforward now. If you play like rook c8, here, I haven't even thought about this move yet. I think just b5's happening. And the reason that b5's happening is tactical in nature, I think. It is morning after all, so I'm going to lean on you guys to tell me what's the tactic after c takes. We will come to a6 Anand. That move makes a lot of sense, and that's what happened in the game, but it's also ill-fated. Okay, so after rook c7, so what? Let's say I play queen takes d4. Gotta show me that you see what's gonna happen here. So it might be like rook c7, queen c4. I'm sorry, queen d4. You should also be ready for just rook takes back on c7. So there's really two main lines here after rook c7. All right, and then bishop c8, Anand. All right, Unitmaster has c b5, rook c7, queen b6, a b6, rook c7. Yeah, I think Unitmaster's variation is complete and correct. So let's check it out on the board real quick, just to make sure we're not losing it entirely. Here, maybe queen c7 is necessary, but that's just depressing. Like, you should probably just resign if you're going to play like that. After rook c7, queen b6, if they take back, they lose this rook in the game. And if they throw this one, it doesn't help at all. So putting pressure with the pawn is really key here. And that's why they should have played a5 instead of queen b6. Queen b6 is interesting because if white moves their queen, then suddenly d4 happens. Feels more active to play queen b6, but a5 stopping b4 was strictly necessary. Because now that it's happening, it's really happening. After a6, black resigned after rook a5. Because they're just losing this pawn on a6 and everything. You know, like after rook b8, we could just play a3 and protect. And the game kind of keeps going here. Rook takes c6 is a nice tactical shot because they were losing the rook on a7. And this is a nice example of a conversion, but it takes a very long time, so I'll just show you the moves. White just maintains full control the entire time on every side of the board, even shirking this free pawn on a5 in order to create a pass pawn. Makes it look easy, right? And this is all that I have here in the notes. So this is a good example of how you can, from the beginning, in a situation like this, saddle someone with the hanging pawns, right? They didn't exist anymore, I mean before. Now they are here. These are the hanging pawns, they're on open files. And these are two half-open files that white can use, that black cannot use. That's part of the idea here. That just the connectedness of these half-open files is useful for white. And then the next thing they do is they blockade, and they deploy every minor piece in rook and queen to accomplish that mission. And then finally, they prepare to, once every piece is active, they prepare to create an isolated queen pawn, which we've already studied, by playing either e4 or b4, b5. But in this example, because black didn't choose a defense against one of these two options by playing a5, white was able to just win the pawn in the first place. And there was no real discussion. I'm wondering if my notes were incorrect, because I had like so many moves after this point that I'm wondering if they didn't like play on for several moves. But so sometimes in these old books, right? So this is based on the old book by Soltis, called Pawn Structure Chess, and it includes some of my notes too. But I haven't looked at this in a few years, so they're old notes. Anyway, the problem with these old books sometimes is that they are getting their information from like paper publications that are not standardized. Also, why does it look so bad on my screen? Hold on, let me fix this. Yeah, they got their information probably from paper publications, and they're not consistent in their reporting. And now we have like digital best versions of these games. So whenever I found the game from Soltis, I either put it into my computer by hand if it didn't exist, or I would find it in an existing database. Padalazio, thank you for following on Twitch. Yeah, so I would either put it in by hand or search it in a database, and often the database version is better than what Soltis had available to him. Yes, welcome to the chat. So I think maybe Soltis thought there was a resignation like here or something, like after losing the pawn, but you know, the notes just go on. And sometimes it's unclear like what's a variation that the author put in and what actually happened. So, tricky business. I also have an example where the hanging pawns wins. So I think I could show that very quickly so that I can move on. So anyway, this one shows how the pawns are only weak when they're under direct pressure. You might think like, hanging pawns, it's weak forever, I'll just go do something else that I like in this position. But you really have to attack them, because if you don't, they can develop the initiative through the use of their hanging pawns. The hanging pawns, it turns out, can also restrict your play if they're not properly blockaded, because they control some critical squares. So this is basically like the same situation we just saw, right? Same opening. But then white took on d5 in this instance. And so, based on the play so far, which side do you guys think is going to get the hanging pawns? White or black? Padalazio is learning isolated pawn structures. I recently did a whole live stream about the isolated pawn structures, and you can check out the recording on YouTube. So if you look at my profile, you can find a link. I have some different recordings on there compared to Twitch. I did like an hour and a half about that. Yeah, so MK and Anand have it, that white is going to have the hanging pawns. And the way that you know is that they already have a pawn on d4 in the center. And the only way they could get C and D pawns on open files is if black takes on c3. And it's not possible for that to happen the other way, because the only capture that white has available is to take on d5, which doesn't lead to hanging pawns. If they both try very, very hard, black could maybe get hanging pawns, but it would require a lot of cooperation and maybe a handshake or some money. So anyway, bishop c4. Bishop e7 and castling from both sides. Rook e1, and finally it happens, right? So now we have the hanging pawns. And black played a little lacklusterly, I think. b6 probably makes some sense. I don't know. Hold on. What would I play here, now that I think about it? easy to criticize. I'm kind of tempted to play like Queen A5 here. So, just if I had to throw in my fastest 2 cents without thinking too hard, I think this move looks pretty enticing. And B6 closes the door on playing Queen A5. But it also goes for a very straightforward, well-known development scheme with your bishops on E7 and B7. So, nothing wrong with that. And yes, these positions are very similar to the isolated pawn structures. We just looked at one game, so you could go through the playback later on. We went through one game where white wants to create the hanging pawns and then blockade them and then turn it into an isolated queen pawn structure. So the strategy is quite similar. Alright, now after queen c2, black has to play g6, which is quite helpful. Interesting tidbit though. So why should black not play h6? Is there any downside for this? I mean, yes, because I'm asking you, but like, what do you guys think it is? There's a specific plan for white that I think is quite effective here. I said some sacrifice. Yeah, I mean, you could sacrifice. I think even without a sacrifice, white has a very promising plan to develop here. Yeah, bishop h6 is the sacrifice you're looking for. But in this position, I would not sacrifice. Like here, after g takes, nothing's happening. You can throw bishop h7 check, but I'll play probably king g7. And I think after rook h8, probably white's the one who's losing. The plan, if they play h6, is to play queen e2 and queen e4. Or play bishop c2 and bring the queen to d3. And both of these things are pretty achievable goals once h6 is played. If you do all of that and h6 is not played, they will just play g6 and your pieces will have to be redeployed again. So it's important that you wait for h6 to play those ideas. Yeah, rook e3 and rook g3 is also available, but I think that's true for both h6 and g6. Not to say that rook e3 and rook g3 is winning in both cases. I think it's a dangerous journey for the rook. So it depends. I'd like to build a certain amount of activity before doing the rook lift. I also did an entire video about rook lifts, so if you are curious about that specific idea, I have at least one example where the lift is rook e3 to g3 in one of my old streams that's uploaded to YouTube. So they played g6. And after bishop h6, rook e8. Black's position is just kind of passive. White played queen d2. Kind of eyeing those dark squares on the queen side. And black played rook c8. So this is the first position where I think we should really discuss a lot. White has a lot of the same kind of attack as in the Isolani, is the note that Soltis gave for this position, if I had to summarize it. But there is no pressure on the center pawn. So you can see the hanging pawn structure can be extremely beneficial for the attacking side if they can just avoid being blockaded, because it's like the isolated queen pawn without any risk of losing material, if you can get that kind of active position. So could be even more dangerous, but it's also like kind of more to love. Like your pawns, you have two pawns that can also become targets. So whoever gets the upper hand, maybe it's a magnified kind of advantage. I know I personally like playing against the hanging pawns because I'm usually pretty good at shutting down all this active play. out of the opening. So how should white build their attack, I guess, is the next thing. Well, if you play knight g5 right now, they're going to just take it, right? Well, maybe they won't take it, but they could play... they should intend to take it. So how would that go? Knight g5. Maybe I would... Actually, maybe after knight g5, I'm just going to say your attack's not happening, and I'll play knight a5. With the idea of blockading and attacking your center. I don't know how you will improve after knight g5. I mean, maybe, but... what was your follow-up on Und? I think when we are attacking like this, we can't just guess one move at a time that easily. Although, of course, when I ask you guys what should we play, we are sort of doing that. But whatever we guess, I think it should be based on some kind of like slightly longer idea. It should have at least like a 2-move combination in mind. Alright, MK wants to attack on the queen side with a4. That's interesting. After a4, I think I can kill some birds with stones by playing knight a5. Maybe just blockade that a-pawn. And also keep the option of playing knight c4. And not to least, knight a5 threatens knight b3. But of course you can deal with that. And here's a hint, okay? So if black had played h6, then white would play like bishop c2, queen d3, or queen e2, queen e4. But since they played g6, there's some other downside. So what would that downside be? Anand has a nice idea to play h4, h5, and this is kind of the right idea. So in the game, they played rook b1 first, and after bishop f6, they went ahead with h4. So pop quiz, why can't they play bishop takes h4? It's tactics time. It looks like a free pawn. So why not? This game was played between Botvinnik and Rogozin. So do you guys think Botvinnik will just give a free pawn like that? Probably not. Botvinnik is probably one of the more impressive world champions, in my opinion. He had a very long, successful career. And did a lot for chess overall. Through education. Although I can't say I know any books by Botvinnik. It's kind of funny. So Anand wants queen f4. Yeah, why did Rogozin not play the Rogozin? Maybe he hadn't come up with it yet. After bishop h4, queen f4, I think they'll just play like bishop e7 and be fine. I think healthy pawn up at that point. Oh no, maybe not bishop e7. Maybe bishop f6. Because after queen f4, bishop e7, knight g5 might actually be annoying to meet. Actually no, probably it's... Yeah, I don't see why we should let it happen. Bishop f6 is fine. I could probably go back to f6 and still be okay. Are you guys stumped about what's happening after bishop f4? Bishop takes h4? Well, let's start with knight takes h4, right? I think it's pretty logical, because worst case scenario, you have the bishop pair. And if you're going to do anything kind of active, it should start like that. I don't see any other move that makes a ton of sense, because the bishop's going back. So if we play knight h4, the bishop can't go back, right? So they have to play queen h4. So what's the most active move after queen takes h4? After queen h4, it should be bishop g5. And after bishop g5, it's not totally trapped. They still have queen h5 and queen g4. Right? This is just my calculation so far. After queen g4, there's rook e4. And if they play like queen f5 or something, it's probably not totally fine. If they play queen h5, it's definitely not fine. There's rook h4. And thanks for the follow. It's the Master John LCT TV. Let's play it out a little bit. Here, if they play queen f5, I expect to win this game very quickly. Like, maybe this. Oh, sorry. Bishop's hanging. So I should just directly go for my main idea. Just attack on the h-file. They have to save their queen, so they might go here. Hold on, do we even have... We might even just have this, winning the queen. It's early, but it's not that early. I think we're winning the queen. Okay. So, and if they go here, then this was what I saw earlier. So I think the queen is getting trapped. But you have to see a couple specific details. Okay, so they cannot do it. Hey John, welcome to the chat. So they play queen d6 instead. Bishop f6 after queen d5. Oh yeah, maybe there's a way to finish there as well. But after queen d5, I think they're just losing the queen as well. Now after bishop f4, queen a3, they got h5. So this is the realization of Anand's idea. If you play queen h6 to start, they'll play bishop g7 and kick you out. So it's not really coming to fruition. So you have to really break up their structure some with h5. So here comes knight a5, trying to go for that plan, but it's a little bit later than it should be. So now how do we keep this attack going? After queen h5, bishop e2. Okay, so it looks like the queen's also trapped in different ways maybe. If you want to play queen h6, you need to be playing some kind of bishop move to get your queen to that square, right? So that's a big hint for this position. Gaius Trimalchio is commenting, thanks for the lesson. Following YouTubers that teach the thought process behind chess has been instrumental. I'm really glad that you think so. Glad you're benefiting from it. And feel free to check out my other content. I've done like a lot of educative streams. And I think they're all kind of long, so they don't get recommended so much by YouTube. But I usually break them into chapters, so you guys can follow along one example at a time in a chunk that is appropriate for you. And I think I cover pretty good topics. Anand says h takes g6, maybe. I think that if you're going to go for the maybe route, you should make black wonder if they should be taking on h6 or not. I'm sorry, on h5. So whenever you have this tension with the h-pawn and the g-pawn, it's good to maintain until the critical moment. Because if you liquidate... Ooh, too many arrows. I'm a little tired. If you liquidate this tension too early between these pawns, right? What happens is black has some clarity that allows them to defend Like, for instance, if they know for sure you're not going to push on to h6, they could focus their defense now on controlling the open h file. So it's good to avoid that if you can. Knight e5 is preventing knight c4, so in that sense I like knight e5. Yeah, I wonder about knight e5. But it's not my main choice, and I'll show you why in a second. But it looks somewhat reasonable. I think the issue here is that your pawn is hanging on c3. So if we're doing something very active, it should also be winning the game. Like, let's see if... So after queen c3, right? I want to run away from this queen with queen h6, but I find it's impossible with my bishop on f4. I really want to go for some checkmate or something, and it's not happening anymore. So the moment is really critical. I have to admit, guys, I don't really like Chess Network. I think the content's a little superficial, but my opinion I formed a long time ago, so I'm prepared to admit that I was wrong if their content has gotten much better recently. I want to sack the knight? Not for free, do you? Like, I just don't know how. Because after queen c3, if the queens get traded, there's nothing to sack for. There's no attack. So after bishop e5, this is a better move, because if they play queen c3, we trade and then take the bishop on f6. And if they take here, I think taking with the knight makes the most sense. Now if they do this, we can play queen h6. And this is really real. Maybe even queen f4 here might be stronger because it actually threatens mate right now. They would have to defend f7. And let's suppose they do that. Well, rook c1 is also kind of happening, so they can't really play rook c7. So let's say they play rook f8. I think this might be money, because like they do this, we play h6, and if they like take this, for instance, I was thinking like bishop h7 type stuff, but maybe we should prepare it with the idea that was shared by Padalazio earlier, to play rook e3 and rook g3. I think this is probably lights out. Like, they can have it, I don't care. That's it. They have to like give the queen for like a knight or something and still get checkmated. So I think queen f4 is actually more impressive than queen h6. But the sentiment is the same. Like, I don't want to trade these queens. So by throwing in bishop e5, we gain a critical tempo by which we can avoid the queen trade. Yeah, guys, I think Chess Network was one of the very early chess content creators. So in that sense, it was important that they put out some content back in the day, and probably still put out content. So they played queen e7, and after bishop f6, queen f6, knight e5 finally happened, so Anand gets their dream. And after rook e d8, knight g4, I think white just has like full control of the dark squares. They play queen g7. And now this is a difficult moment, in my opinion, for the attack. I think that the lectures that are 50 to 120 minutes, they're really kind of difficult to get most people to pay attention to. So if that fits your if that suits your need, that's really good. Okay, so Anand wasn't sure about bishop takes f3, so let's go back to that. After bishop f3, I think I'm taking on f6 with queen h6. I think it's like everything you ever wanted in a chess position. So this part is, I think, difficult because we've gotten rid of those dark square bishops. We haven't gotten a favorable trade like getting rid of this bishop and, I'm sorry, like getting rid of their dark square bishop for only a knight. But what we do have is really active pieces. And we do have better control of the dark squares all the same because our knight finally reached a really good square. So how do we improve our position from here? I think this is really a challenging moment. So if you're watching the recording later, this is a good moment to pause. h6, queen h8, queen f4, trying to lock the queen in. That's an interesting idea. Although I doubt they'll play queen h8. Like probably if they're playing any anything, it should be queen f8. Because I don't think knight f6 is actually a big threat. Like queen f8, knight f6, king h8. That looks more defensible to me. But maybe you're quickly getting in like g4, g5 and locking it all down. So maybe that's also good. After h6, is there even a good option? Interesting question. Well, anyway, I also had an answer for your queen f4 idea. So if you play h6, queen h8, queen f4, they might play f5. I still think, so Anand says that he hates that his opponents never play the moves he calculates. I kind of get that, but I don't think that the calculation is wasted effort because it familiarizes you with the position. So you're more equipped to deal with the sudden pivot in a new direction. I'm going to play this variation out because it seems kind of interesting. I think here f5 is probably necessary to prevent all the knight f6 and everything, like winning the game. So probably we would see something like this. But this doesn't keep the pressure on e6, so they might even choose something. Actually, I don't think they even have a move that really keeps the pressure on. So they might play like this. And after bishop d5, maybe black is actually successfully returning to their strategy of blockading these hanging pawns. But the position is also kind of chaotic because now e6 is a permanent weakness. h6 is also kind of a permanent weakness if we go to the endgame for white. Yes, this is a very interesting position, but probably it's too interesting. Like white should try to get something very clear. So I think the way that white tried to get clarity was with hg6. And they can't take with the queen, so h takes g6 is the most obvious. And now here, how do you take full control of the dark squares around the king? What do you guys think? White to play. And take control. Rook b5 looks interesting. After rook b5, I think I might play rook d5. Just say like, okay, let's trade that one active rook if I was playing black. But I think MK has it. It's queen g5. This is taking full control of the dark squares. Now knight f6 is a really dire threat. But you know, Anand should be happy too because after king f8, rook b5 happens. So it's the same idea. But actually, I wonder if it's even important to play queen g5 first. My feeling is that it is, like it's a closing window. But I don't know really if there's a downside for this first. like, oh yeah, after rook d5 here, we don't get queen g5. So I think probably that's an obvious answer. Yeah, so here, they had to play this, I think, because if they played rook d5 here, we win the rook with a double attack. So rook b5 happened, and now here if they play rook d5, we can just take it and keep attacking, I think. Like, chop. If they want to blockade, they should probably play bishop takes. Also, if they don't want to let the rook in, that would be deadly. And then here, probably knight f6. And the first thing that comes to my mind is to play rook e3, rook h3, and rook h7, not rook h8. That does look pretty good to me. Here they could take like a couple different pawns, though, so maybe I should be like less lackadaisical about the whole thing. Might have to calculate here. Well, if they take this, I don't really mind, I guess. For instance, this check is really nothing. Like, they can't play queen h8 because of rook h3. And if they take this one, I wonder if I'm missing some knight d7 cheap shots or something. Here I still kind of feel like this is going well with rook e3, but I might be completely off base. Not that sure. I'm going to check this with a computer, actually. It says white's winning with rook takes, bishop takes, and rook e3. It's a huge advantage. So yeah, I think I was actually just completely right there. So they played knight c6. Knight f6 happened. And I'll do a little bit of show and tell here, because I think the really critical part of this that sort of happened. We've built the attack, and now white's just kind of finishing it off with the rook lift. And here the knight has to go, unfortunately. But luckily this helps white keep their advantage. I mean, initiative. So then they went for queen e7, active pieces. Doubled on the e-file, so there's no f6 stuff ever happening. They played rook d7 to try to kick out the queen because it's annoying, so the queen went to h4 where it's still annoying. And after queen h8, queen f4, the position is just kind of generally difficult for black. The nicest thing that could happen for black is white could play g4, allowing queen h1 mate, but I think that's like the only thing. So here comes queen g7. How should we redeploy our pieces here to try to finish off the game? What do you guys think? I think the end is 9, so it's a good idea to see how we could finish it from this really good position. Nidgm just followed, thank you, on Twitch. Rook f3, it's a good idea in spirit because you're attacking f7, which could be weak, but don't forget about the bishop on c6. I think that if they can make that trade, it'll benefit them a lot. Because their bishop right now is not contributing to defending the king. So if they can use it to get rid of an attacker, it'll definitely help them. Bishop e4 to get rid of the bishop is pretty logical, but I think that since their bishop is useless, we should try to leave it on the board. Like it's not really helping them very much. So since our bishop is better than their bishop, being able to attack g6 and all, I'd like to maintain it. There's a good thought though. Like for example, bishop e4, and then queen e4. You know, you still have a nice position. Anand's going crazy with rook h5. It just might work. and Gaius says Rook H3. Okay, so the Rook gang. We have so many options here. Here, let me make a note about this one first. I think Anand's idea is this. Hoping for a draw. White is probably still slightly better here, even. Actually, I'm not sure, because C3 is weak, and I think that when there are weaknesses in the enemy camp, the two rooks can like really jump to life. You know, we might see something like this. But Black's king is also unsafe for the time being, so I think White might have enough to keep this going. Like maybe they could do this one, which also stops king e7 and wins the h pawn. That could be nice. And then it becomes sort of maybe some kind of race to the finish. Like they're trying to take all the queenside pawns, we're trying to take pawns and start attacking their king. It's chaos. Kind of interesting. We also have Rook H3 suggested by, I think it was Gaius on Twitch, or YouTube, actually. This was also suggested by NitGM. I think the problem is it's not really threatening anything. Like, if I play, for instance, Bishop D5, even if you play a move like Queen H4, you're not going anywhere. The queen's like a super bishop, just protecting the entire king's area. So I think it's hard to build from here. You probably still could, but I would be a little more flexible and play Rook G3. In the game, they played Bishop D5, which was kind of my quintessential show me what you want to do move for Black. And here they played Rook EG5. So you might have also been able to start with Rook EG5. But the idea is the same. We're doubling on the weak point G6. The bishop on D5 can't protect it, but we can attack it with every force. And because their king and their queen are living there, it's working out tactically. So Black played Rook C3. Really, it's barely working, because they have some counterplay. Yeah, with all minor pieces gone except light square bishop, we are not kicking the queen out. So we have to go after it with the heavy pieces. I think that makes a lot of sense. So how do we finish things off now? You know, we redeployed the pieces in a good way, and it's time for a tactical moment. This will probably be our last position for today. NitGM's on the right track. Queen B8 check also looks interesting. Let's see if they both work. Bishop G6 is actually a winning move, but you have to see some specific details. So if anyone's watching the recording, they might want to pause here and see if they can work those things out before we tell. But after Bishop G6, if they take with the pawn, it's kind of obvious. You play Rook takes G6 and you're winning. But what about Rook takes G3? The key here is that you should throw Bishop F7 in between. Because if they play Rook takes F7, we have Rook takes G3, and we win the queen. It's pinned. Nothing to do. So in the game, they played Bishop F8, which allows Rook G7, and Bishop E6. This is really important because it means we get one more piece. It doesn't become just queen against rooks, which can be very difficult to win. So the other option that we had, that was a really nice line, by the way. That's how the game ended. But we also had this option. So let's just see if this is similar. I haven't even looked at it, so this is kind of interesting. I think the only move is Queen F8, because if they play King H7, then there's Rook H3, and we are clearly taking everything. Is it so clear? I think so. Everything's with check, right? Yeah. Yeah, I think this is still pretty clear. Maybe we could even go, yeah, why not? I think this is good. Threatening Queen H8. So if they play Queen F8, we can probably try the same idea. But The downside of this case is that they can play Rook G7. So it's nice, similar idea, but I think it's not quite working out because they have Queen F8 and then Rook G7. So just to reiterate, this was the nice tactical sequence that ended the game. After Bishop G6, they took here to avoid a worse fate, but this allows Bishop F7 and then winning the queen. And this might look like there's actually hope because it's 2 rooks against queen, but then there's this discovered check that's really critical that they really could not have avoided in any way. Okay guys, so these were my 2 examples for the hanging pawn structure. And this was based on Soltis's book, which is an old book, but I really like it. So if you guys ever see it, I think it's pretty nice. And I hope to see you guys next time. Also, just a quick plug for my new merch thing. I started this a couple weeks ago. I have some mugs and stuff that are pretty cool. So if you really like this, feel free to check that out. The link is on my YouTube profile page. I also have a Twitch command for that. But yeah, I hope to see you guys for another live session. I do this pretty much every Sunday. I also have been doing simuls recently on Fridays. So you can see my schedule and everything that's upcoming. Usually I put all the schedule on YouTube. And yeah, thank you guys for showing up. NitGM and Gaius and all the new people and stuff. And all of our old time people like Anand, who's always here. It's really nice. Yeah, that's true, Anand. In these games, it's pretty much always like there's a positional domination that culminates in like one big tactic. It's rarely the case that there's a tactical melee along the way in these old classical games. But modern chess has become really different from that. I think during the era between like maybe Petrosian and like Anand, people could play this kind of classical way where it's like they have an idea, their opponent doesn't know what they're up to. They execute their idea, and then it's a nice win that culminates in one tactic. But in the modern era, everybody knows what's going on, and it's a complex fight. Anyway, take care, guys. Thank you.